Hi everybody, it's Mrs. Jennifer, the director at the Cook County Library. Today at our first chapter virtual program, we're going to try a different genre and one I haven't read in a very, very long time. We're going to look at the first Mountain Men series by William Johnstone. This is a very popular Western series here at the library, and there are quite a few of them. So I thought I might try this one on called Preacher's Frenzy. There seem to be at least 6 or 7 on this preacher character, so I thought it would be a good way to introduce you to the preacher's character and to the series. This one happens to be a large print, and we have quite a few that are large prints, so if you need a large print book, this might be the series for you, especially if you like Westerns. So anyhow, Chapter 1. The alligator lunged at Preacher, massive jaws wide open and sharp teeth ready to clamp down on him with flesh-rending ferocity and bone-crushing power. The mountain man dived out of the way and then flung himself back across the muddy ground, slipping and sliding a little on the bayou bank. The gator writhed after him, its tail thrashing wildly as it pursued him. Preacher had to leap straight up to avoid the next savage attack. He turned in midair so he faced the same direction where he came down on top of the gator. Preacher clamped his knees around the deadly reptile's barrel-shaped torso and yanked his hunting knife from the sheath at his waist. As the alligator curled its head around toward him, trying to reach him with those deadly teeth, Preacher leaned forward and rammed the blade into the creature's right eye as hard as he could. The gator spasmed, thrashing so hard that it almost threw Preacher off. Even in the beast's death throes, these massive jaws continued snapping, so Preacher figured the safest place for him was still on top. He hung on, hugging that wet, scaly hide as he ripped the blade free and struck again and again. The gator rolled over onto him. Preacher's ribs groaned from the weight. Then abruptly the burden lifted and Preacher found himself on top again, but only long enough for him to grab a breath and replace the air that had been forced out of his lungs. The gator rolled onto him again, and both of them tumbled off the mossy bank and into the bayou. Water splashed high around them and flooded into Preacher's mouth, nose, and eyes. He gagged and spat out the stinky, slimy stuff. A few yards away, the gator continued to flail and send water flying into the air with its futile struggles. Death had claimed the creature already, Preacher's knife having pierced its prehistoric reptilian brain, but that message hadn't caught up with the alligator's body. Where one of the blasted creatures lurked, there could be another, or more. Preacher reminded himself, not to mention the cotton-mouthed moccasins, and who knew what other dangerous things. Best to get out of the bayou as quickly as he could. As he pulled himself out of the water, a foot in a high-top black boot stomped down right in front of him, squishing water out of the muddy ground. Preacher stopped and raised his head so his eyes could follow the whipcord-clad leg up to the burly torso of a man pointing a flintlock pistol at his face. From Preacher's angle, the barrel of that pistol looked about as big around as the mouth of a canyon, with the hammer already pulled back and cocked ready to fire. You know, you never should have come into the swamp, Mountain Man, the fellow said. Preacher thought about the gator and everything else he had run into in this blasted muck and knew the man spoke the truth. Preacher made his home in the mountains, and he never should have left St. Louis 3 weeks earlier. There she be, Preacher said as he reined horse to a halt atop a brush-dotted hill with a view down toward the settlement sprawled beside the Mississippi River. I know, Charlie Todd said as he brought his horse to a stop as well. I've been here before, remember? Aaron and I outfitted here before we headed west. Even after all this time, Charlie's voice still had a little catch in it when he said his friend's name. They had been close, and Charlie hadn't forgotten, would never forget, the terrible way Aaron Buckley had died. I know how you feel about your doing all you can for him, Preacher said. Taking his share of the money from those pelts back to his family is more than a lot of fellows would have done. He jerked a thumb over his shoulder to indicate the 4 pack horses on lead ropes trailing behind them. Those animals carried bundles of beaver pellets that Preacher and Charlie planned to sell in St. Louis. Charlie and Aaron came from the same town back in Virginia, and the 2 young men had headed west together, looking to make their fortune in the fur trapping business, and have some adventures along the way, to be honest about it. They had found adventure all right, more than they had bargained for since teaming up with the rugged mountain man known as Preacher. "You're sure about not coming back out here?" Preacher went on as he and Charlie sat on horseback looking down at the St. Louis in the distance. A faint haze of smoke from all the chimneys hung over the settlement, a sure sign of so-called civilization. Charlie sighed and nodded. "I'm sure, Preacher. I've had enough of the frontier. You're cut out for it, but I'm not." Preacher regarded his young companion for a time. Charlie's time in the mountains had toughened him, honing away the soft pudginess, turning his fair skin bronze, giving his features a harder, more seasoned cast than they had been when Preacher first met him. But at the same time, Preacher knew the truth of what Charlie said. The young man had survived the wilderness and all its dangers, and he could be justly proud of the fact, but the time had come for him to go home. "All right," Preacher said, "let's go sell those furs." He nudged the wrangly gray stallion called Horse into motion and started down the trail made by thousands of saddle mounts and pack animals as fur trappers set out for and returned from the distant mountains. Ahead of them, the big wolf-like cur known only as Dog bounded on down the gentle slope on the outlook for a rabbit or some other prey in the clumps of brush. Suddenly he stopped and stood, stiff-legged, the hair on the back of his neck and along his backbone standing up a little. Preacher heard the low growl that came from the cur's throat and reacted instantly. "Dog hunt," he yelled. "Split up, Charlie." He jerked Horse to the left even as he shouted the commands. From the corner of his eye, he saw Charlie veer swiftly to the right. Charlie had spent enough time with Preacher to know that he needed to follow the mountain man's orders immediately, without hesitating or even thinking about them. At the same time, Dog leaped forward, low to the ground. As a rifle boomed from the brush, the ball kicked up dirt well behind the big cur. He disappeared into the growth, his thick fur making him heedless of any branches that might catch and claw at him. Preacher guided Horse with his knees as he yanked 2 loaded and primed flint-lock pistols from behind the broad belt at his waist. He saw a muzzle flash from the brush close at hand, followed instantly by the roar of a shot and a spurt of powder smoke. A low hum sounded in his ear as the ball passed close. Thumbing back the hammer of his left-hand pistol, he pointed it and pulled the trigger. The weapon, double-shotted with an extra heavy charge of powder, bucked hard in Preacher's hand, but his great strength controlled the recoil. The balls ripped through the brush, rewarding the mountain man with a cry of pain. Somebody else screamed over where the brush thrashed around, and Preacher figured Dog had introduced himself to the ambusher. He threw a glance towards Charlie, still mounted and with his rifle at his shoulder. Preacher fired into the brush in the other direction. Movement caught Preacher's eye as another man to his left stood up and fired an old-fashioned blunderbuss at him. Preacher had plenty of time to duck, and as he did, he turned in the saddle to bring his right-hand pistol to bear. Smoke and flame billowed from its muzzle, and the ambusher flew backward as if slapped by a giant hand. Preacher knew both balls had slammed into the man's chest. The first man he had shot wasn't out of the fight after all, he discovered a second later. The would-be killer burst out of the brush, shrieking in rage. Crimson coated the left side of his face from a wound that had laid his cheek open to the bone. One of the balls from Preacher's pistol had ripped along there, and it should have been enough to leave the man whimpering in pain on the ground. Instead, he used the agony to fuel his anger. He had a tomahawk in each hand, and he whipped them around as he rushed toward Preacher and Horse. The stallion trumpeted shrilly. Horse would have reared up to the back to fight back with slashing hoofs, but Preacher didn't want his trail partner to get hurt. He kicked his feet free of the stirrups, swung his right leg over Horse's back, and dropped to the ground to meet the assault. He barely had time to let the empty pistols fall to the ground and yank out his knife and his own tomahawk. The wounded ambusher's arms moved in a whirlwind of motion as he slashed at Preacher, but the mountain man's reflexes were up to the task of avoiding the strokes. He darted and weaved, blocked some of the blows and ducked others, and then he closed in to launch an attack of his own. The knife in his hand flicked out and sliced through the inside of the man's upper left arm. The blood cut deep, severing muscles and nerves, and the tomahawk in the ambusher's hand dropped from suddenly useless fingers. The man swung the right-hand tomahawk, coming close enough to knock the broad-brimmed brown hat off the mountain man's head. That was the high water mark of his attack, though. It had left him open to a sweeping stroke of the tomahawk in Preacher's left hand. The weapon smashed into the side of the man's head with a crunch of bone. His knees buckled, and Preacher stepped back to let him topple forward onto his ruined face. Seeing no sign of anyone else about to attack him, Preacher turned to see about Charlie. The young man had drawn his pistol, and as Preacher watched, Charlie lifted the weapon and fired it. Then he exclaimed, "Blast it! He get away?" Preacher called with a dry tone in his voice. Charlie turned in the saddle to look at him. "Yes, he made it to a horse and rode off. Shouldn't we go after him?" "Not sure it'd be worth the bother. You did for one of the varmints, didn't you?" "I think so." "Better be sure," Preacher warned him. "Nothing more dangerous than a man who you think is dead but ain't." With a wide-eyed look of alarm on his face, Charlie hurriedly dismounted and drew his other pistol as he stalked into the brush. By the time he came back a minute later, Preacher had already started reloading his pistols. "The other one of this side is dead." "All right," Charlie reported. He swallowed hard. I shot him in the head. I aimed for his chest, but I guess the shot went a little high. Got the job done, though, I expect." Preacher tucked the ready pistols behind his belt again as Dog emerged from the brush with blood on his muzzle. Preacher nodded toward the herd and added, "So did Dog." "Why did they ambush us?" "Those pelts," Preacher said as he leaned his head toward the pack horses, which stood stolidly nearby, still attached by lead ropes to horse. "Some fellas think it's a good idea to lurk out here on the trail and wait for somebody to come along with a load of furs they're planning to sell in town. This ain't the first time I've been jumped by varmints like that." "Highwaymen," Charlie said. "Well, this trail ain't exactly a highway, but I reckon it's the same idea." "What about those men? The carcasses?" Preacher swung up on the horse's back. "I don't feel like burying them. Do you?" "No, not really," Charlie replied. "Can't say as I do." The two men rode on toward St. Louis as overhead buzzards began to wheel slowly through the sky. Well, that's the first chapter of Preacher's Frenzy, which, like I said, is part of the first Mountain Man series by William Johnstone. It appears that the Mountain Men series, actually has a bunch of different characters. So you might want to check out some of the other characters that are part of the Mountain Man series. And like I said, this Preacher character, I know for sure that we've got at least 5 or 6 of these Westerns. So you might want to come and try the first one or grab a couple others. I'm not sure that it matters whether you read them in sequence or not. But this looks like an interesting book. It's about trappers and St. Louis and the Old West. You never know. It even has New Orleans in it. So thank you for listening to August's edition of First Chapter Live. And next month in September, I plan to read a nonfiction book. I'm not sure whether it'll be for women or men. Maybe I'll pick one that's generic enough, and we'll try a nonfiction book to try and get you interested in the library's nonfiction collection. Thank you very much. Have a great day, and I appreciate you using the library. Be well. Take care of yourself. Bye.